You ever watch someone make a mistake so big you almost feel sorry for them before it even finishes happening? Because that was exactly what I felt the moment I heard the sharp metallic snap echo across my quiet suburban street at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. The sound carried through the cool air like someone dropping a wrench on concrete, and for half a second, I thought it came from a construction crew somewhere down the block. Then my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a motion alert from the driveway camera. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked over, and opened the app, still smelling the fresh coffee brewing behind me. And that was when I saw her, Melissa Grant, HOA President, Oak Ridge Estates, standing next to my Jeep with a pair of bolt cutters in her hands. The chain I had looped through the wheel and post hung loose, now the steel links resting against the gravel like a snake that had just been stepped on. Behind her, a tow truck idled at the curb, diesel engine humming low and steady, exhaust drifting through the morning sunlight. The driver leaned out the window, waiting for instructions. Like this was the most normal thing in the world. Melissa adjusted her sunglasses, glanced toward the street, and gave him a little wave, the kind of casual signal someone uses when they think they are completely in charge. That Jeep she was pointing at was parked in my own driveway on property my grandfather bought 40 years ago, the same driveway where I used to wash his old pickup every summer. The gravel still crunching under tires the same way it did when I was 12 years old. But according to Melissa, the Jeep was a violation, an eyesore, a threat to property values. Her exact words from the last letter she taped to my door 2 days earlier. I watched the camera feed in silence, the metallic smell of the coffee maker heating up, mixing with the faint scent of motor oil drifting in from the open garage. The tow truck rolled forward slowly, the steel hook rattling against the lift arm as the driver lined up with the front tires of my Jeep. Melissa crossed her arms, satisfied, like she had finally solved a problem that had been bothering her for weeks. The funny thing about power trips in neighborhoods like this is that they always look official. Clipboards, letters, HOA bylaws printed on expensive paper. People like Melissa convinced themselves that rules are the same thing as authority. And that was the moment I realized she had absolutely no idea what she had just done, because that Jeep sitting in my driveway, the one she had just cut the lock off, the one she was about to have hauled down Maple Ridge Drive like some abandoned project vehicle, didn't just belong to me. Not really. What she was ordering that tow truck to take was a government-issued surveillance vehicle assigned to a multi-agency police task force. And every camera, every radio, every locked equipment case inside it was logged in a federal inventory system that did not appreciate things going missing. I took a slow sip of coffee, still watching the feed, as the tow truck operator stepped out, adjusting his gloves, gravel crunching under his boots. While he walked toward the front bumper, Melissa said something to him. I couldn't hear through the camera, but I could see the smug smile on her face, the one she always used when she thought she had won. And right then, standing there in my kitchen, watching my own driveway on a 5-inch screen, I realized Melissa Grant had just made the most expensive mistake in the history of Oak Ridge Estates. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and 3 months before that tow truck rolled into my driveway, I thought inheriting my grandfather's house would mean quiet mornings. Exactly like that one, coffee on the counter, sunlight coming through the kitchen window, and the familiar sound of gravel whenever someone drove past on Maple Ridge Drive. My grandfather bought this property back in 1983 when Oak Ridge Estates was still half farmland and half new construction. He used to tell me the land smelled different back then, less fertilizer, more cedar trees, and rain. After he passed, the place sat empty for almost a year until I finally moved back into town to take care of it. The house is not huge, about 1,800 square feet, ranch style, with a wide driveway that runs almost 40 yards from the street to the garage, the kind of place where every neighbor can see exactly what you are doing, which normally would not bother me. Except Oak Ridge Estates also came with something my grandfather never had to deal with, an HOA, and that HOA came with Melissa Grant. Melissa moved into the neighborhood about 6 years ago, and within 12 months, she somehow became president of the association. Nobody seems to remember the election very clearly, but suddenly there she was, driving around in a white Lexus with a clipboard in the passenger seat, like the whole subdivision was her personal inspection route. Melissa is the kind of person who talks about property values the same way doctors talk about blood pressure. Everything is a risk to the neighborhood: the wrong mailbox, the wrong fence stain, a pickup truck parked in the driveway for too long, and apparently a dark green Jeep with government plates sitting in front of my garage. For the first couple of weeks after I moved in, she mostly watched from across the street, standing beside her flower beds, pretending to adjust the sprinkler heads while studying my house like it was a puzzle she intended to solve. Then the letters started. The first one arrived in a white envelope taped neatly to my front door. Violation notice, unauthorized vehicle storage. According to the HOA guidelines, any vehicle considered commercial, government issued, or non-residential could not remain visible from the street for extended periods of time. I remember standing on the porch reading that letter while the late afternoon sun warmed the wood railing and thinking how strange it was that someone cared so much about a parked vehicle. The Jeep itself is nothing flashy. Four-wheel drive, standard duty suspension, reinforced bumper plates, the kind of utility vehicle most people would overlook in a grocery store parking lot. But Melissa noticed everything about it bothered her. The matte paint, the antenna mounted near the rear window, the fact that it did not look like something purchased from a dealership showroom. She sent 2 more letters over the next week, each one a little more formal, each one mentioning potential fines starting at $50 per day. My sister Rachel laughed the first time she saw one of those notices. She teaches 4th grade across town and stopped by one evening with a grocery bag full of takeout containers. The smell of fried chicken and cornbread filled the kitchen while she flipped through the paperwork on the counter. Ethan, she said between bites, this woman writes like she is running a city government. But the problem was Melissa believed exactly that. She believed those letters gave her authority. And standing in my kitchen that morning watching her direct a tow truck toward my Jeep, I realized she had finally decided to enforce it. I kept watching the screen while the tow truck driver walked around the Jeep like a mechanic studying a stubborn engine problem. The morning sun reflected off the windshield, and for a second, the camera lens caught the small government plate on the bumper, but the driver either did not notice or did not care, because Melissa was already talking again, pointing at the wheel, like she was explaining exactly where the hook should go. I could almost hear her voice, even though the camera recorded no sound, that same sharp tone she used during our first conversation 3 weeks earlier. The day she marched across my lawn holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that looked polite from a distance, but carried the same energy as a warning label. I had been tightening a bolt on the Jeep that afternoon when her shadow stretched across the driveway. The air smelled like warm asphalt and cut grass, and somewhere down the street a lawn mower droned steadily. Melissa stopped 3 feet away from the front bumper and studied the vehicle with narrowed eyes like she had discovered something offensive. Mr. Caldwell, she said, finally drawing out my last name as if she were testing it. I wanted to introduce myself properly. Since you are new to Oak Ridge Estates, I wiped the grease from my hands with a shop towel and nodded, trying to keep the conversation simple. Because people like Melissa rarely wanted information, they wanted control. She flipped open the clipboard and tapped the paper with a manicured fingernail. Your vehicle does not comply with community standards, she said. The wording sounded rehearsed, like she had practiced it in front of a mirror. Apparently, Oak Ridge Estates had very specific expectations about what should appear in a driveway. Families here preferred clean sedans or polished sport utility vehicles, preferably in neutral colors. Preferably new. What they did not prefer was a government utility Jeep with reinforced panels and equipment mounts visible through the rear glass. It disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood, Melissa explained, as if she were describing a landscaping project rather than someone else's property. I remember the smell of gasoline lingering faintly from the last time I had refueled the Jeep and the distant hum of traffic on the county highway a mile away. I also remember thinking how strange it was that a person could stand in someone else's driveway and speak with that much certainty about what belonged there. I told her calmly that the Jeep was registered and legally parked on my own property. That should have been the end of the conversation, but Melissa closed the clipboard slowly and looked at the vehicle again the way a building inspector studies a cracked foundation. Mr. Caldwell, she said, community standards exist for a reason. If residents begin ignoring them, the entire neighborhood suffers. Property values decline, order disappears, and suddenly Oak Ridge Estates looks like any other street outside the city limits. The way she said outside the city limits made it sound like a place people should fear, not visit. That was the moment I realized Melissa did not see neighbors. She saw a system she intended to manage. And standing in my kitchen, now watching the tow truck operator crouch beside the Jeep with a steel hook in his hand, I understood that Melissa Grant believed she was about to enforce that system for the good of the community. What she did not realize was that the vehicle she was about to remove was not simply parked there by coincidence. It was parked there because my job required it, and the equipment inside it was part of an investigation that had nothing to do with neighborhood appearances and everything to do with people who cared a lot less about HOA guidelines than Melissa Grant ever would. I set the coffee mug down and kept watching the screen, While the tow truck driver slid the metal hook under the front axle, the steel clinked softly against the suspension, and the sound traveled through the camera microphone just enough to reach my phone. It was a small sound, but it carried a lot of meaning, because the moment that hook lifted the Jeep off my driveway, this was no longer a neighborhood dispute about landscaping or property values. It became something else entirely. The driver worked carefully, like a man who had done this job thousands of times before, adjusting the chain and tightening the winch, while Melissa stood beside him with her arms crossed, supervising every step like a project manager inspecting construction progress. The morning air outside looked calm through the camera feed, the same quiet suburban street where sprinklers clicked rhythmically across green lawns, and a delivery van rolled past 2 houses down, leaving the faint rumble of its engine fading toward the intersection. Maple Ridge Drive always smelled faintly of wet grass in the morning, especially this time of year when the temperature hovered around 65 degrees and the sunlight had not yet burned away the dew. On any normal day, the scene would have looked peaceful, but watching it through that small screen, I could feel the tension building. One simple movement at a time, the Jeep shifted slightly as the winch tightened the front tires, rolling a few inches across the gravel with that familiar crunch that echoed through the driveway. I knew that sound well. I had heard it 1,000 times, backing the vehicle out before sunrise, heading to briefings downtown, or returning late at night after long hours spent documenting surveillance reports. The vehicle itself had been assigned to me almost 8 months earlier. Standard issue task force equipment, dark green body, reinforced frame, communications antenna mounted near the rear panel. Most people would glance at it and assume it belonged to a park ranger or a construction supervisor, which was exactly the point. Utility vehicles attract less attention than polished black sedans with tinted windows and official markings, but inside that Jeep, behind the locked compartments and secured cases, was equipment that did not belong to any homeowner association. Cameras calibrated for long-distance observation, encrypted radios connected to multiple departments, hard drives containing weeks of investigative recordings, everything cataloged, everything logged, everything traceable through federal property inventory forms that left very little room for misunderstanding. And yet there was Melissa Grant standing beside the tow truck, nodding confidently, as if she had just solved the greatest threat Oak Ridge Estates had ever faced. I leaned closer to the phone screen and noticed something almost amusing. The tow truck driver paused for a moment, looking uncertain at the government plate mounted on the bumper. It was not flashy, just a small number sequence stamped in black metal, but experienced drivers recognized those details. He glanced toward Melissa again, and she responded with an impatient gesture, like someone waving away a minor inconvenience. The driver shrugged and continued tightening the cable. Gravel shifted under his boots as he walked back toward the truck cab, preparing to lift the Jeep fully onto the platform. That was the moment my phone buzzed again. A new notification appeared across the screen. Incoming call, Rachel Caldwell. I answered and heard the familiar sound of her car engine humming through the speaker, followed by the slight rush of wind through one open window. Ethan, she said quickly, I just passed your street, and there is a tow truck in your driveway. The tone in her voice carried the kind of concern that comes from knowing something feels wrong, even if you cannot explain exactly why. I glanced back at the camera feed, watching the Jeep begin to rise slowly from the gravel, and took another calm breath. Rachel, I said quietly, do not worry about it. Let them take it. I kept the phone against my ear while the camera feed showed the tow truck lifting the Jeep another few inches off the driveway. The steel cable tightened with a low mechanical whine, and the front tires left the gravel completely, now hanging just above the ground. Rachel slowed her car, because I could hear the turn signal ticking softly through the speaker. Ethan, are you sure about this? She asked. I can see it from the corner. Now that woman from the HOA is standing there like she owns the place. The calm in my voice surprised even me. Sometimes, but years of investigation work teaches you something important. Reacting too early only ruins good evidence. Rachel, I said, listen carefully. Do not stop, do not argue with anyone, and do not pull into the driveway. Just keep driving to school. Everything happening out there is already being recorded. The security cameras around the house captured every angle: the driveway, the street, the side yard, even the small cedar tree beside the mailbox where my grandfather once hung a bird feeder. The morning sun reflected off the camera lens for a second, and I watched Melissa step closer to the Jeep, examining it like she expected something dramatic to happen. Once it left my property, she looked pleased in the way someone does when they finally prove a point to themselves. I could imagine the conversation She would have later with the HOA board describing how she personally corrected a violation and restored order to the neighborhood. That idea almost made me smile, because the truth was much larger than anything Melissa believed. She was managing. The tow truck driver climbed back into the cab, and the hydraulic lift hummed quietly. As the rear wheels of the Jeep rolled onto the metal platform, the vehicle settled into place with a soft, metallic tap. When the chains tightened around the frame, it was a routine process, the kind performed thousands of times every day across the country when a car blocks a fire lane or sits too long in an apartment parking lot. But routine procedures become very different when the wrong vehicle is involved. I watched the camera feed while the truck operator walked around one last time checking the straps, and Melissa leaned against the mailbox speaking to him again. She looked confident, relaxed, even amused by the entire situation. The driver nodded slowly, still uncertain about something, perhaps the government plate or perhaps the equipment mounts he noticed through the rear window. Either way, Melissa's confidence seemed to reassure him, because he climbed back inside the truck and started the engine. The diesel rumble grew louder for a moment, then settled into a steady idle. As the truck prepared to pull away, Rachel spoke again, her voice softer. "Now, Ethan, this feels wrong. I know that woman she complains about everything: trash cans, fences, lawn height. But towing a vehicle from someone's driveway, that seems extreme." I watched the Jeep shift slightly on the flatbed as the truck rolled forward a few feet. The tires of the tow truck crushed the gravel, leaving fresh tracks across the driveway, where my grandfather used to park his pickup after long days working construction sites across the county. I took a slow breath and looked at the camera feed one more time before switching the phone to the contact list. "Rachel," I said calmly, "I promise you everything is under control. In fact, the moment that truck leaves the street, the real part of this morning finally begins." Then I ended the call and dialed a different number, the one saved under Task Force Operations Coordinator, because there are certain conversations you only make after someone else has already finished making their mistake. The operations coordinator answered on the second ring, his voice steady and already awake, the way people sound when their workday starts before sunrise. "Called, well?" he said. "What is going on?" I glanced once more at the security camera feed where the tow truck was slowly rolling down Maple Ridge Drive, the Jeep secured on the back, like just another vehicle headed toward an impound lot. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic. A quiet neighborhood, a clean street lined with maple trees. Mailboxes painted the same shade of dark bronze. Sprinklers ticking across perfectly trimmed lawns. It looked peaceful enough to appear on a real estate brochure. But inside that Jeep was equipment that had been logged into a federal property database less than 12 hours earlier. Cameras calibrated for long-distance observation, encrypted communication radios that linked directly to the regional task force network, storage drives containing surveillance footage collected over the past 3 weeks, all of it cataloged, all of it assigned to an active investigation. I took a breath and spoke calmly. "A tow truck just removed Task Force Vehicle Unit 37 from my residence." I said the removal was initiated by a homeowners association president without authorization. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind of silence that happens when someone mentally rechecks what they just heard. "Repeat that," he said slowly. I watched the truck reach the end of the street and pause at the stop sign while a school bus rolled past in the opposite direction, the flashing lights reflecting off the Jeep's windshield. "Unit 37 has been towed from private property." I repeated. "The removal was ordered by a civilian who believed the vehicle violated neighborhood guidelines." Another pause, longer this time, followed by the faint sound of a chair shifting in the background. "Ethan," he said, "you are telling me a civilian just authorized the towing of an active task force vehicle?" "That is correct," I said calmly. The coordinator exhaled quietly, and I could almost picture the expression on his face, because situations like this fall into a category nobody plans for. But everyone understands once it happens. Federal equipment does not simply disappear into a local impound yard without paperwork. There are protocols, forms, jurisdiction reports, and most importantly, questions. Lots of questions. I watched the tow truck turn right onto the county access road and disappear behind a row of oak trees. The camera feed froze on an empty street, the gravel driveway, now quiet again, as if nothing unusual had happened. "All right," the coordinator said finally, "stay where you are. Do not confront anyone. Do not retrieve the vehicle yourself. We are going to handle this properly." That word "properly" carries a lot of weight in law enforcement, because proper procedures create a chain of documentation that cannot easily be ignored. Once the process begins, every decision becomes part of an official record. I leaned against the kitchen counter listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of coffee, still lingering in the room outside the neighborhood, looked exactly the same as it had 15 minutes earlier, but the situation had already shifted in ways Melissa Grant could not possibly imagine. The coordinator spoke again, his voice more focused now. I am notifying the sheriff liaison and the regional equipment supervisor. Unit 37 contains registered federal assets, so the retrieval process will involve multiple departments. Understood, I replied. Then he added one final sentence, the kind spoken very calmly, but carrying the full weight of what was about to happen. Ethan, whoever authorized that tow, just created a very complicated morning for themselves. I stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes after ending the call, letting the quiet settle back into the house. The coffee maker clicked softly as it finished heating the last of the pot, and through the front window, Maple Ridge Drive looked exactly the way it always did on weekday mornings. A neighbor walked his golden retriever past the mailbox. A delivery truck stopped 2 houses down to drop off a package. Nothing about the street suggested that a chain of phone calls had just started moving through 3 different law enforcement offices across the county, but that is how these situations work. The moment a report enters the system, it begins to travel from one desk to another, gathering attention along the way. I rinsed my mug in the sink and set it beside the drying rack when my phone vibrated again. The same operations coordinator, this time his voice more focused than before. Ethan, we have confirmed the vehicle registration and the equipment inventory associated with Unit 37. He said the sheriff liaison is already contacting the local towing companies to identify which operator received the removal request. I glanced out the window again. The gravel driveway still showed the fresh tire marks from the tow truck tracks leading toward the street, like faint chalk lines across the ground. Understood, I said. He continued speaking in the same calm tone people use when procedures begin shifting into motion. Once the towing company confirms possession of the vehicle, they will be instructed to hold it in place until deputies arrive. The task force equipment supervisor is also preparing documentation regarding the federal assets stored inside. I nodded, even though he could not see the gesture. That documentation alone would create a stack of forms thicker than most HOA rulebooks. Inventory reports, transfer authorizations, liability statements. Every item inside that Jeep had a serial number and a record attached to it. When those records move through official channels, they tend to attract attention. Ethan, the coordinator, added, do you know the name of the individual who ordered the tow? Yes, I said. Her name is Melissa Grant. She is the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Another short pause followed. I could almost hear him typing that information into a report. All right, he said quietly. Then we will proceed through the proper channels. I thanked him and ended the call, placing the phone back on the kitchen counter. The house felt still again, except for the low ticking sound of the wall clock above the refrigerator outside. The sky had brightened into a clear blue, and sunlight now stretched across the street, reflecting off windshields and porch windows like a row of mirrors. For several minutes, nothing unusual happened. Then I heard the distant sound of an engine approaching from the direction of the county road. It was not loud, but it carried a deeper tone than most neighborhood traffic. I stepped closer to the window and watched as a dark sport utility vehicle turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, followed by another a few seconds later. Both vehicles slowed near the intersection, scanning the street the way experienced drivers do when they are looking for a specific address. The lead vehicle rolled forward until it reached my driveway, then stopped briefly before continuing down the block. The second vehicle followed at the same steady pace. Neither one had flashing lights or obvious markings, but their presence carried the quiet authority of official business beginning to unfold. Somewhere farther down the road, the tow truck driver was probably arriving at a storage lot, preparing paperwork for what he assumed was another routine impound. Meanwhile, those 2 vehicles had just entered Oak Ridge Estates, and within a few minutes the calm routine of Melissa Grant's morning was about to become something far more complicated than a simple violation notice. 10 minutes passed after the 2 dark vehicles rolled through the neighborhood, and during that time Maple Ridge Drive stayed quiet enough that a person could hear the distant hum of traffic from the county highway. Almost a mile away, the sprinklers across the street shut off one by one, leaving thin mist drifting above the grass, while a breeze carried the faint smell of fresh-cut lawns through the open kitchen window. I stood near the counter watching the street, because experience teaches you that when official calls begin moving through departments, things rarely stay quiet for long. My phone buzzed again, This time with a message from the operations coordinator. The towing company had been identified within minutes. Apparently the driver had followed routine procedure and logged the impound request into the county tow network. The message included the company name and the address of their holding yard located about 12 miles away near the industrial district on the edge of town. That yard now contained a task force vehicle full of registered equipment, and that fact had already been communicated to the sheriff liaison. I read the message once more before setting the phone down. Outside, the neighborhood still looked peaceful, but the calm felt temporary, the way air feels before a thunderstorm finally breaks. A few minutes later, the same two sport utility vehicles I had seen earlier returned from the far end of the street and slowed near my driveway again. This time, they stopped completely. The doors opened almost at the same moment, and two deputies stepped out wearing standard county uniforms, their badges catching the sunlight as they looked around the street, like people confirming they had arrived at the correct location. One of them glanced toward my house and raised a hand in a polite greeting before speaking quietly into a radio microphone clipped near his shoulder. I stepped outside onto the front porch, where the wooden boards still felt cool from the morning shade. The deputies walked up the driveway with calm professional expressions, the same way officers approach any situation that requires information before action. "Good morning," one of them said. "You must be Ethan Caldwell." I nodded and introduced myself. The deputy explained that their office had received notification regarding the removal of a vehicle registered through a federal task force, and they were confirming the details of the report. While he spoke, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the sidewalk across the street. Melissa Grant had returned to inspect the driveway where the Jeep used to sit. Her expression carried the satisfied curiosity of someone checking the results of a completed task. When she noticed the deputies speaking with me, her posture shifted slightly, the confidence still there, but now mixed with the alert attention of someone realizing the situation had become more formal than expected. The deputy followed my glance and noticed her as well. "Is that the individual who requested the tow?" he asked. Quietly, "Yes," I replied. "That is Melissa Grant, president of the Homeowners Association." The deputy nodded thoughtfully and turned toward the sidewalk. Melissa walked across the street with measured steps, adjusting her sunglasses as she approached, clearly expecting to explain the situation the way she had explained it in violation letters and neighborhood meetings. "Good morning, officer," she said with a friendly tone. "I hope there is no confusion. I authorized the removal of that vehicle because it violated our community regulations." The deputy listened patiently, his expression neutral as he wrote a few notes in a small pad. Then, he asked a simple question that carried more weight than it appeared at first. "Did you know the vehicle you authorized for towing was registered as part of a federal law enforcement task force operation?" The silence that followed settled across the driveway, like a sudden change in weather, and for the first time that morning, Melissa Grant looked genuinely uncertain about what she had started. Melissa did not answer the deputy right away. The confidence she carried across the street a moment earlier seemed to pause mid-sentence, like someone reaching the end of a script that suddenly no longer applied. She adjusted her sunglasses again and glanced briefly toward my driveway, where the Jeep had been parked less than an hour earlier. "Well, I did not know anything about federal operations," she said carefully. "I simply followed our community guidelines. That vehicle has been sitting there for weeks, and several residents complained." The deputy wrote another short note in his pad, the same calm expression still on his face. I noticed how deliberate his movements were, the way people in law enforcement tend to move when they know documentation matters more than volume or emotion. "I understand your concern about neighborhood standards," he replied, "but the vehicle you authorized for removal contains equipment assigned to an active law enforcement task force investigation." For a moment, the breeze moved through the maple trees lining the street, and the leaves rustled softly above us. The quiet neighborhood looked unchanged: lawns, trimmed sidewalks, clean, the same calm suburban scene Melissa had spent years trying to control. But the meaning of the situation had shifted entirely. The second deputy stepped forward slightly, speaking into his shoulder radio and confirming a few details with someone on the other end. I caught a few phrases: vehicle identification confirmed, equipment supervisor on route, holding yard notified. Each phrase sounded routine, but together they formed the outline of a much larger administrative process now unfolding. Melissa crossed her arms again, though the posture felt less confident than before. "Surely this can be resolved easily," she said. "I mean, the towing company can just return the vehicle if there was some misunderstanding." The first deputy nodded politely. "That is exactly what will happen," he Said the vehicle is already being secured at the towing yard and deputies from our office are meeting the operator there now to ensure the equipment remains accounted for. Once the inventory check is complete, the vehicle will be returned to its registered operator. He closed the small notebook and looked at her again with the same professional tone that had not changed since the conversation began. However, the report regarding how the vehicle was removed will also be reviewed because federal equipment was involved. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was clear enough. Melissa looked toward me, then perhaps expecting some reaction, but I simply leaned against the porch railing listening to the wind move through the trees. My grandfather used to say that the quietest moments often reveal the most about people, and standing there, I could almost hear him laughing softly at the situation unfolding in the driveway. The deputies thanked me for confirming the details and returned to their vehicles. A few minutes later, the engine started with a low, steady rumble before both sport utility vehicles rolled slowly back toward the intersection. Melissa remained on the sidewalk for a moment longer, watching them leave the way someone watches a storm cloud move across the horizon, realizing too late that the rain is already on the way. Later that afternoon, the Jeep returned to my driveway, exactly where it had been parked that morning. The tow truck driver looked more careful this time, checking every document twice before lowering the wheels onto the gravel. When he finished, he nodded politely, climbed back into the cab, and drove away. Without another word, I locked the chain through the wheel again, the metal links settling into place with a quiet clink that echoed across the driveway. Maple Ridge Drive looked peaceful as ever, but the neighborhood had learned something important that day. Real authority does not shout across a lawn or write letters about paint colors. Real authority shows up quietly, signs the right paperwork, and lets the process speak for itself.